now I want to talk to you guys about this Financial Times report that was repeatedly translated or given to the Financial Times from European officials that says that Trump's gambit when it comes to supporting Ukraine moving forward is if he's unable to find a deal come, January 20th, January 30th, going into February, that Donald Trump's going to push for a 5% NATO defense spending target. Now, for those of you who don't know what that means, the defense spending target in NATO is currently 2%. And what it states is that you need to be spending 2% of your country's GDP on defense for you to be up to NATO standard. So you could have enough troop carriers and shells and whatever you're going to need in the event that there's a war. And also so that that financial commitment, that defense commitment, acts as a deterrent. Because then a other country could say, well, NATO's 1 billion people. 1 billion people through all these countries, spending 2% through all those pretty sizable economies. They have a decent defense. Let's not go mess with them. So it works as a diplomatic deterrent, and of course, in the event of a crisis, in the event of an actual war, you would be semi-ready. But multiple countries don't hit that 2%. Namely, for example, Canada, who's been at 1.2 to 1.3% for a bit. And with Canada's current financial crisis, it's not really in a position where it can move up massively. And now Trump wants 5%. Now that is more than double the 2% current target. Many people talked about maybe moving up to 3% or 3.5%. And there is talk that this could be a fear or a scare tactic to get them to at least start investing. So maybe they get to 3.5. Basically, you say a big number, hope that they go up a little bit, and then they'll hit your goal number. But the point is, Trump wants Europe to spend more on its GDP, more of their GDP, maybe up to 5%. In order to contribute more to NATO's defense spending so that America isn't 50% of NATO's entire defense budget. But on top of that, if they do that, then Trump will continue to support Ukraine. Essentially, the gambit is you take your own security seriously. You invest in your own security, probably in the process buying a lot of American weapons and working with a lot of American defense contractors, then we'll continue to support Ukraine's security. Let's read a little bit of this Financial Times piece, and then we'll discuss the implications if this report is true. Donald Trump's team has told European officials that the incoming U.S. president will demand NATO member states increase defense spending to 5% of GDP, but plans to continue supplying military aid to Ukraine. The U.S. president-elect's closest foreign policy aides shared his intentions and discussions with senior European officials this month, according to people familiar with the talks, as he firms up his policies towards Europe and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. During his White House campaign, Trump vowed to cut off aid to Ukraine, force Kyiv into immediate peace talks, and leave NATO allies undefended if they failed to spend enough on defense, spooking European capitals. But in a boost for allies deeply concerned over their ability to support and protect Ukraine without Washington's backing, Trump now intends to maintain U.S. military supplies to Kyiv after his inauguration, according to 3 people who offered their briefing on the discussions with Western officials. At the same time, Trump is to demand NATO more than double its 2% spending target, which only 23 of the alliance's 32 members currently meet, and that number is up from previous numbers. It was 11 or 12 before Ukraine was invaded. To 5%. 2 people briefed on the conversation said. One said that they understood Trump would settle for 3.5. See, this is 5%. Okay, this is really a tactic to get you to 3.5. It's a negotiation. He's swinging crazy numbers, and then they'll throw a counter number of 3%, and then they'll move up to 3.5. So he's trying to wiggle the best number he can out of them. One person, and it's also much more realistic, 3.5%. One person said they understood that Trump would settle for 3.5%, and that he is planning to explicitly link higher defense spending and offer of more favorable trading terms with the United States. It's clear that we are talking about 3% or more for NATO's June summit in The Hague, said another European official briefed on Trump's thinking. NATO allies are already in discussions about increasing the target to 3% at that meeting of leaders in June, but many capitals are concerned about the difficult fiscal decisions that would be required to do so. Canada cannot hit that number. I don't know what, I mean, they just came out with a report indicating that they're actually in a much bigger, much worse deficit. They're almost doubling their previous deficit estimates. Germany is in a spending crisis right now, where a debt ceiling that they're going to have to get rid of in order to do some public investment to not only fix their failing infrastructure problem with some bridge collapses and just problems that they have with infrastructure, but also to make up the gaps that are being created in Germany due to a faltering car market, because people are buying electric cars from other locations and they're just, they're not able to compete with other Chinese manufacturers. I mean, not to say that they can't produce any cars, just they're not at the heights that the German car manufacturing industry used to be. And they've got economic problems in Germany. And so these countries have economic problems, and trying to increase spending on the military right now is going to mean taking on debt, and it's going to mean difficult economic decisions. And a country like Germany that's been, has literal monuments to their low amount of debt, that's very proud of the low amount of debt, they're going to have to change. They're going to have to change their spending if they intend to hit these numbers, while not taking massive domestic fiscal negatives for the civilian population. NATO allies are already in discussions about increasing the target to 3% at the meeting's leader in June. According to the White House Office of Management and Budget, the U.S. will spend about 3.1% of its GDP on defense in 2024. During the last year of Trump's first presidency in 2020, the Pentagon spending hit a 3.4% target. Key European NATO allies, including France, Germany, the UK, Italy, and Poland, met NATO Secretary General. By the way, can I just say, for those of you like Cenk Uygur who are banking on the idea that, well, maybe I can get in there and I can get the Trump government to spend less on the military industrial complex. Good luck, buddy. Okay, just good luck. Good luck. Key European NATO allies, including France, Germany, the UK, Italy, and Poland, met NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. By the way, Mark Rutte, as a NATO Secretary General pick, one of the better options, not necessarily because Mark Rutte is like the most pro-Ukraine, but because Mark Rutte is known as somebody who can talk to Trump quite well, communicate with him, and is someone who's probably not going to have a very prickly relationship with the man. So somebody that definitely, since now Ukraine aid has largely been centered in NATO institutions, who might be able to get more out of him. And this is now how we're going to have to talk about Ukraine aid. What can we get out of Trump? On Wednesday night, to discuss how the continent would adapt defense policies in response to Trump's return. Okay, we're almost done. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz separately held a telephone call with Trump on Thursday during a summit of EU leaders. Scholz later told reporters that he was quite confident that the U.S. and Europe will continue their support to Ukraine. Senior British security officials traveled to Washington earlier this month to assess the president-elect's plans. While Trump still believes Ukraine should never be given membership of NATO and wants an immediate end to the conflict, the president-elect believes that supplying weapons to Kiev after a ceasefire would ensure a peace-through-strength outcome, they added. After 24-hour meetings with NATO and EU leaders in Brussels this week, Zelensky said on Thursday that European pledges to defend Ukraine would not be sufficient without U.S. involvement. Okay, so here's a few things I'm going to throw out there. First thing is a lot of this continued aid to Ukraine would probably change depending on whether or not the war is continuing or the war is slowing down. Whether there's going to be a war, the war is going to go on into 2025 and possibly early 2026, or who knows, or if it's immediately going to end. But either way, Ukraine would need continued defense shipments. Because if the war is continuing, well, then they need the weapons to continue to, defend themselves. And if the war is ending, then they need the weapons in order to dissuade a future invasion. Because you cannot be naive and just assume that the Russians are not going to invade again after they lied about invading multiple times and then immediately invaded. And the same ideology that Putin held that helped him, that made him want to invade, is going to be the same one he's going to hold a year, 2, 3, 4 years after 2024, 2025. Why would you plan as if another invasion was not possible? It would just be silly. So you would need to prepare the Ukrainians. But, and this is the big problem for a Trump peace plan, and is why we've seen some shifts in his rhetoric where he seems to acknowledge now more how complicated the situation is, and an immediate ceasefire might not be possible. The problem is if the Ukrainians want to stop any future Russian invasions, but the Russians want to keep open the possibility that they could at least threaten to invade again in the future, then these are just two differences that are very hard to flesh out negotiations, because one is we don't want to be invaded again, and the other is we want the ability to invade you again. They're two conflicting. It's not easy to pad these things away. Now, the idea of okay, but if we continue weapon shipments but not keep them in a defense arrangement, the Ukrainians aren't going to really want to accept that, because they want a guarantee that another invasion would not happen. And that's the compromise position. The Russians, if they got their way, they wouldn't even want the military shipments, because they don't want to make a bigger problem for them down the road, a bigger road bump for them to have to cross over if they want to invade again in the future, which I do think is likely if history is to, continue along the general trend it has so far. And so this is a big difference that they have not fleshed out. Not to even talk about the territory, not to even talk about the children that have been kidnapped that have to be returned, not to even talk about all the war criminals that if there be any trials around them, very unlikely. Rebuilding, any type of reparations, continued sanctions on war criminals post-war, warrants for those war criminals, the different issues of reconstruction, whether or not people are going to be able to return to frontline villages and homes, and if the ceasefire actually holds, how to maintain the ceasefire, not only by having disincentives from continuing to attack, but monitoring and making sure that you're monitoring so people can't lie about it after attacking, after doing a shelling. These are all things that are going to take time and be really nuanced to negotiate, and the two sides have not close in their positions really much at all, except for the fact that Zelensky seems to be open to the idea of settling some of the territorial disputes down the line. But of course, not only does he not want to give up any territory, he doesn't have the constitutional purview to do so, since the Ukrainian constitution is clear that territorial changes to Ukraine's territorial sovereignty can only be made by a 2/3 majority of the Ukrainian Rada, which Zelensky cannot just sign away in negotiations. Just like the president of the United States cannot just say, I'm going to make us a single-payer healthcare system. They'd have to actually go to the House and Senate and get it passed. And so, as much as people talk about Ukraine becoming like a one-party dictatorship, in moments like this where you're talking about, what would need to be ratified for negotiating, it certainly is not the case. It is a society that has civil institutions and elected officials that do retain influence. So for me, when you look at the fact that the Russians very well might want to invade again, which is conflicting interests, that the Russians want to take a bunch of territory that they currently do not hold, like Zaporizhia, the city of Kherson, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, that's a conflicting interest. The fact that, the ideological conflicting interest where Putin believes that Russia has a right to domineer over Ukraine, and the enabling of Ukraine to stop the domineering is the conflicting interest. I think it's likely that the war continues into 2025 and the negotiations fail. Now, I'm not going to say that for sure it's going to fail, because Trump is a kind of unknown element. And if Trump is more willing to say, okay, yeah, the Ukrainians don't need Kramatorsk. What's Kramatorsk? What's Sloviansk? He doesn't process what this means to Ukrainians, the significance it holds from the war in the Donbass, how many refugees from Donetsk have been displaced to go there. Or if he was like, oh yeah, give up Kherson, and just completely discounts the human safari and give the civilians that the Russians have been hunting over to the Russians. If putting aside any scenario where he does something like that, there's I think a likelihood where the Russians don't accept the negotiations next month and they continue to fight. Or if negotiations continue, it'll be through back channels, through intermediaries in places like Oman, and will not be some open extravaganza where it ends in 24 hours like Trump originally said. Who would have thunk it? Big surprise. The war is actually more complicated than that. But if that war continues and you want to retain leverage, if you want to treat this seriously as a serious negotiator, then you're going to have to continue the flow of aid from the United States to Ukraine until a deal is reached, at least at current levels, unless you risk degrading your negotiating position and just allowing your opponent to wait you out, which means continuing to send the rest of the aid that has been approved by Biden and is likely not going to be sent in its entirety by the time Trump gets in the office. But not only that, it doesn't mean not pausing that only, unless he wants to pull some, let's undercut Ukraine aid again, like he did during the Battle of Avdiivka that got a lot of people killed. If he was to pull something like that again, it wouldn't really make much sense for him, since he'll be the president and he's not just undercutting Biden and the Ukrainians at that point, he's also undercutting himself. But putting aside any scenario like that, he'll have to approve more aid. Now, this is where we get into the area that we're avoiding the scenario where, you know, a deal is not likely. Trump just completely pulls the rug from out of Zelensky because he doesn't want this personal political disaster for him. He doesn't want an Afghanistan moment. He knows the majority of Americans still support Ukraine, despite what his advisor Tulsi Gabbard or RFK or his WhatsApp texting with Matt Gaetz might tell him. The majority of Americans still support Ukraine. He takes in this realization, continues to support Ukraine. But the thing that scares me now is not only the sporadic nature of Donald Trump, where we're avoiding the worst case scenarios, but we still have the constant, no matter what scenario we get, like flip-flop nature of Trump, where we're going to be, you know, walking on the tightrope around whether he's going to continue to support Ukraine or not, while avoiding the worst case scenarios, which is good. But also, on the other hand, while we're walking this tightrope, I fear Donald Trump is going to deliver on something he recently said in an interview where he was talking about the possibility of continued support for Ukraine, and he said it might not be at the same numbers that we've been sending them, indicating that Trump might get the Europeans to pick up more spending of money on Ukraine, try to get them to send more military support, even though they just don't have the production right now to take up the numbers that we have been putting out, but take up what they can. And then the United States will send less while the Europeans are sending more, therefore getting about where we were before, just with more European support with less American. But if that's the approach we take, then we're not pursuing an end to the war, we're pursuing a perpetuation of the war. If we want to end the war, and we want to do this through strength, through the philosophy that Trump is pushing, then you would want to increase the pressure. And the philosophy wouldn't be send 10 to 15 billion over 5 to 6 years, 15 each year. It would be send 50 to 100 in 1 to 2, front load the aid, and try to end it as quickly as possible. If the death and the destruction and ending it as quickly as possible, as Trump has talked about again and again and again, as his main priority, is really what matters. Because it certainly isn't that this war is negatively impacting American liquefied natural gas exports. It's certainly not that this is really upsetting the American economy all that much. So if it really is about the, you know, bringing down the nuclear threat and the death and destruction, but also through peace through strength, then you're also going to have to increase the pressure on the Russians and deliver on the second part of his threat, which he might be hesitant to do so, especially if they're bringing on people like Albridge Colby. I doubt he'll have that much influence, but bringing on realists like that onto the administration's team, which is to actually increase aid. Be like, okay, well, if the Russians aren't going to negotiate in good faith, we're going to have to increase aid to put the Ukrainians in a better negotiating position, to put the Russians under pressure, so then the Russians will cave. But if the plan is to decrease aid and have the Europeans pick up the slack, then you might just end up being in the same position that Biden was in and repeating the same mistakes of the Biden administration. But you would get the Europeans to pick up the slack, but then by sending less aid, you're at the same position. You're at the same total amount of contributed aid. And so the battlefield hasn't really changed all that much. All you've done is you got the Europeans to pay some more. So you haven't ended the war, you haven't brought us anywhere closer. And that's the scenario that scares me. Because it's not the worst case scenario, it's not the base case scenario. It's just a perpetuation of this war, and it's one of the scenarios where I could see it dragging on and on and on, where each side is going to be using less and less and less equipment as time goes on, as it becomes like a slugfest. And I would rather that not be the scenario, because that drags on the war longer, in my mind. So I'm hoping that it's a scenario where if they do continue aid, It's with a plan to win, or at least be in a good leveraged position where the Russians are going to have to come to the negotiating table and treat the Ukrainians as some sort of equal. Certainly better than the worst case scenario discussions, though, that people were having, including me.